Welcome,
Probably
Bob.
good, yeah.
Welcome, Nick.
Hello.
Hello. Oh, there he is. All right. Safe and sound.
Still connecting audio.
We just saw an empty truck with the door open and we weren't sure if we needed to have an intervention safety meeting. Welcome, Gus. Glad to know you're safe and sound.
Hello.
Hi,
Hey there.
welcome. And I actually don't know this group. Oh, Karen, okay. So how many people are total?
Let's see, actually, I don't know the total head count. Thea, do you know off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, I believe we have 14,
Is it 14?
14,
15, I think.
15.
50.
Okay.
Well, we're a little bit light, but why don't we get started?
Sure. We'll wait to Brandon officially connected. Welcome, Karen. So, recording in progress. Well, good afternoon, folks. You'll notice I'm not Deb Myhoff, who's been your facilitator, but I'm filling in and just request some grace and patience jumping into this space on her behalf. She's focused on family, rightfully so, and given the circumstances, I'm able to come in. Some of you may know that I'm facilitating the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, so I'm not completely separate from this work, but it's a great opportunity to be in this space together. So we're going to move through several discussions. We're going to start with some framing on the referral process. We're going to move through some overview of some of the key questions, considerations, and I think Nick will prove complexities of the data landscape and really spend the bulk of our time today discussing how DLCD should be evaluating progress and performance for the referral process. So I'll note that also some of this is overlapping with some of the OHCS work as they work to develop equity indicators, which has an engagement process that's tied. So there's just a lot of intersections in the conversation you all are having today with the broader landscape of the ONA work across the state. So we'll move through this conversation. We'll close our meeting with next steps and go from there. And so I'm going to assume that you all have done your introductions. You all have read and absorbed the meeting materials. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Thea to help frame the focus today.
Yeah, glad to see you all, and good afternoon. I'm going to spend just a couple minutes resituating us sort of in the statute. I'm going to start really sort of briefly talking about how the referral process is laid out in 197A.130. So starting with sub 3 and then moving backwards, so bearing with me. Sub 3 lays out the statutory obligation to refer sort of an unknown subset of cities into the Housing Acceleration Program. And to go through that list real quick, it's cities that have failed to adopt a housing production strategy, cities that have failed to take actions outlined in their adopted HPS, cities that have been referred into the acceleration program via an LCDC issued enforcement order, and finally, cities determined to be the lowest performing, quote, lowest performing at the midpoint of their housing production strategy cycle. That fourth one there is actually sort of where we're going to be spending the crux of our time, because it is the most complex. The first three pathways into the referral process are relatively straightforward. But to help us respond to that fourth, we need to talk about sort of what this lowest performing actually means. So in sub 2 of the statute, it gives us 3 inputs to consider when weighing what qualifies a city as low performing. So one is a city's progress toward total housing production. Two is a city's progress toward affordable housing production. And the third is a city's performance as demonstrated by a quote, statewide equity indicator. I know that you all have spent a lot of time sort of thinking about these factors, considering them, and probably feeling like we do that this third one, this equity indicator, is pretty hairy. So I think the intent here was to codify production, affordability, and choice into law. The first, yeah, like I said, the first two are pretty straightforward, but when we get down to how to measure equity, it's just it's tough. So we want to dive right into that conversation now. I am happy to bring Nick Chun in to talk about this. He's our partner with Echo Northwest, and he's been working with us and with OHCS to develop these metrics. We're going to sort of start here to ground our referral conversation. So he's going to tell us a little bit about like the good, the bad, and the ugly of measuring equity in housing. And then we can sort of kick off our conversation about how we want to look at these factors when we're talking about progress. So Nick, go ahead and grab the screen. I don't know if you have sharing capability yet.
Yes, I do. Excellent. Look at that. We're off to a solid start already. All right, give me 1 second. Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Chun. I have been the lead on the ONA work, particularly as it relates to developing these equity indicators. Really, for this presentation, I want to focus on one aspect of the equity indicator development, and that's really the conversations and challenges we've had in specifically measuring underperformance. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on a couple indicators, the severe cost burdening and segregation. I just want to remind everyone, because I am giving a presentation view, I actually can't see comments or chats. And so please, somebody let me know if there is a pressing comment that I can address. So we really grounded our efforts with the equity indicators conversation around these two questions. And the first is, how will cities use the housing equity dashboard? And the second is, well, also, how will DLCD use the housing equity dashboard to refer cities? So no matter what methodology or results that we came up with, we wanted to make sure that we had the answer to these two questions. Now, by law, we are required for each city over 10,000 population to produce, to the extent that the department can determine, define, or estimate housing outcomes, housing types produced, and overall land efficiency, housing units built as it relates to disability, such as accessibility and visitability, risk of gentrification and displacement, housing segregation by race and income, environmentally just outcomes, and severe and residential tenants who spend more than 50% of their income on gross rent, so otherwise known as severe cost burdening. Now, I can't see anybody's faces, but I imagine there are some very visceral reactions to seeing what the charge that we've been met to produce these. I want to start off by saying that I highlighted this section right here to the extent that the department can define, determine, define, or estimate, because quite frankly, about half of these are just not, we don't have any foundation to even get started on. And so, such as the new housing units as it relates to accessibility and visitability, environmentally just outcomes, very unclear what that is. Even housing types produced by and overall land efficiency, that data is not created yet. For this conversation, we're not talking about the feasibility of these indicators. We're going to be focusing really on two cases. An example, housing segregation by race and income. I would say, and most people would say, a very challenging thing to conceptualize and operationalize. And on the other hand, we have a severe cost burdening rate. This is something that's more direct, an estimate that is produced by the American Community Survey, something that's updated regularly. And really, through these two indicators, we want to have a conversation of the shared data limitations across these metrics. And really, a lot of these challenges come from these broad questions. So because we have to create a an indicator for across all cities 10,000 above. That means we have to develop a standardized methodology that's relevant to Baker City all the way to Portland. And of course, there's a lot of challenges with that in that cities vary in demographic composition and size. When your city population varies by size, that means that your data quality also varies. And so often, and what we're running into the case now is that some of the smaller areas where it's the hardest to measure and, you know, in a lot of ways need the most help, those are the areas that have the worst data quality and data availability. And then finally, moving beyond the technical limitations, there's an accountability question of, well, if we are going to be using at least multiple equity indicators to refer cities, conceptually, what are metrics that cities could reasonably influence? And then finally, based off of all of these conversations and responses, who benefits and loses? Obviously, there's going to be beneficiaries and people who lose, but really it's unpacking about what are the biases that emerge depending on the decision points that we make. And so for our data equity framework, or sorry, our housing equity framework, it was really guided by 3 questions of how will this be used? How will the metric be used towards accountability or implementation? What are the decision points? So what types of indicators should we include into gentrification or racial segregation? And again, depending on these answers, what are the consequences of who benefits and loses? Now, this created a whole nother set of questions that this is a wall of text that I don't expect everyone to read through. The main thing is that I want to convey here is that we have a lot of questions that are applied across each equity indicator. But the thing that I want to focus on today's presentation are really these 3. So regarding margins of error, when is an estimate too unreliable to use? How do we address, or do we address, the mismatch between data equity principles with the reality that small cities and BIPOC and disabled populations are worse off in terms of data availability and accuracy? And then finally, equity for whom? Cities or populations. So larger cities will have access to more reliable, concurrent, and precise data, but they also have more vulnerable populations. I would like you to keep in mind these 3 questions as I go through the presentation. These are themes that will emerge. And to really kind of ground our understanding, again, another wall of text, I apologize. This wall of text is not meant for anybody to read through. The thing that I want to really center people's expectations is that there are aspirational goals of what we would like the data to look like and what the data availability would be in order to measure these metrics to the fullest ability. And then there's the reality of what types of data that we're actually working with. Now, again, without going into too much detail, the thing that I want to focus on is that there's a lot less text in this reality section than there are in this aspirational section. And I think there is a natural inclination for us to think, and this committee to think about, well, what are ways in which we can improve the data quality? What are ways in which we can make improvements over time? There's a reason why we do this cyclically. There's a reason why we're pushing for this. And I want to, again, think about it in a different way. And one of the ways is that it's grounding our understanding of how data quality and data privacy operates on a systemic level in the US. And currently, in the US, we prioritize, at least public data sets, prioritize data privacy over data quality. And so there is a fundamental barrier that we are facing up against in that there is a zero-sum relationship between data quality and data privacy, meaning that perfectly private data guarantee perfect inaccuracy, and perfectly accurate data guarantee zero privacy for respondents. So a lot of the data that we would want to include or to have in order to answer these questions would require a gross violation of privacy of respondents. And quite frankly, based off of conversations of where the census is at, there is a very slim to impossible chance that we're ever going to move the needle on this. And so the reason I am bringing this up right now is to, again, ground the expectations that we should be thinking about the question of how do we operate within this data reality rather than thinking about how do we get to this end goal over here. And specifically, the question in mind for this is how do we measure underperformance with imprecise and imperfect data? Now, for this, I want to focus on severe cost burning. Again, this is one of the more straightforward estimates that we're dealing with. And I would like to draw your attention to this graphic right over here. This is basically ranking the cities based off of their severe cost burden rate. And so at the top, we have Corvallis, where 39% of renters spend more than 50% of their income on rent. And then down below here, we have Hermiston, where it's about 13%. Now, you may notice that each city is color-coded to some degree, and the color codes are associated with the data quality. So we have good, medium, and bad. These thresholds are relative measures of sampling error. And so this is important because the population size varies across these cities. And so the margin of error in itself is not helpful. So let me provide an example. In Corvallis, the estimate is 39% with a margin of error of 4%. That means that if Corvallis was sampled 1,000 times in the same year or in the same 5-year period, the severe cost burdening rate would range between 35 and 43%. And so that's considered a good estimate. Now we have Hermiston, which is medium. And in that case, their margin of error is also around 5%. And so in this case, if they were sampled 1,000 times, 900 times, the results would be a severe cost burdening rate between 8 to 18%. Now, when we're looking at these estimates, they seem like they're point in time, but really these are ranges. These are ranges of uncertainty. But first, I would like to, let's go into one of the simplest ways in which we can measure somebody underperforming or overperforming. And I want to say that, let's just say that every city that is above the median, they're overperforming on a severe cost burning rate, which means that they are underperforming in terms of affordability. So it's a little bit of a switch there. Now, a higher rate, higher than average rate, it's a little bit difficult to interpret, which is why we have this x-axis. Basically, a city that has a higher than average severe cost burning rate, what that means is that they are capturing more severe cost burning households than they are capturing renter households. And when we map this out on this matrix, unsurprisingly, 25 cities emerge in terms of like these are above average. But what happens if we take into account the cost burden of Corvallis, the cost burdens of Canby and Tigard, and how many of these are statistically significantly different from the median? Well, out of the 25 cities, only 5 cities emerge that are statistically different from the mean. And this is assuming that the median, the average of what we're comparing the threshold of above and below is real. And by real, I mean that there's no margin of error on the median. If we were to include the margin of error of the median, the only city that emerges is Corvallis. Now, maybe that is a very literal interpretation of lowest performing, but I would argue that for the other 24 cities who are on the ground and through their lived experiencing extreme affordability crunches, especially for their renter populations, a method that specifically or strictly ties to statistical significance would be challenged greatly. And another reason why there's a difficulty in relying or kind of putting all of our eggs into statistical significance or creating thresholds, like hard thresholds of if you're above this, it's bad, if you're below this, it's good, is really the biased relationship between data quality and population size. And so here's a chart where on the y-axis, we have relative error. So the higher up you are over here, that means that you have worse data. And then to the right and to the x-axis is population. The further to the right, you have more population. Portland has about 640,000 population. That's why it's positioned over here. And so if we were to use like a hard threshold, like again, like above 50%, top quartile, really it would be easily challenged with specifically in regards to statistical significance. And because statistical significance is tied to data quality, and because data quality is ultimately tied to your sample size, really this type of approach and framework would be prioritizing larger cities only, meaning that only the largest cities would emerge as underperforming. I think in both cases, that's considered problematic. And so I turn your attention back to this triangle of again, asking the question of when is this estimate too unreliable to use? Well, one scenario is, well, we're going to care about statistical significance. Well, if you're thinking about it that way, how do you butt up against the reality that data reality and data aspirations are incongruent with each other right now, meaning that larger cities have better data. And if you were to go down this route, again, equity for whom? Pretty much all of the smaller cities, just based off of their population size and sampling, would be eliminated from their criteria, which is not what the purpose of this project and nor the purpose of the overall bill is for. And so really this forced us to rethink about a way of how are we thinking about underperformance, not necessarily as a static threshold, but really in combination with other things. I would like to point out that for what we're looking at, these are city level estimates, and we're not even talking about sub-city level, like census tract level analyses. Luckily for the majority of these metrics, we can produce it at the city level, except for one. And that one is race and income segregation, because by definition, when we're talking about race and income segregation, we are talking about the physical separation of people, physical separation of phenomena. By definition, we're going to be looking at sub-city patterns of spatial analysis. And so we have to be relying on imperfect and very poor quality census tract data in order to create this. And our approach was really, again, thinking about how do we think about segregation? How do we think about space in abstract form? And when we're thinking about it this way, it's two types of segregation, right? There's segregation within, and then there's segregation between cities. And so in this example, like if you imagine this blue dot is a neighborhood, this may contain all the low-income households in this city. This is a highly segregated city within. Then you have maybe other situations like Oswego, for example, where there's a lot of high-income households. They're all located, or like it's above average in every means when it comes to income. So for concentrated cities like Lake Oswego, they'll score very low in segregation because predominantly everybody is high income. And so looking at either one of these in standalone misses the other half, misses the whole story. And so really what we did for this product was looking at a typology, a matrix of figuring out whether cities were spatially concentrated, spatially segregated, or somewhere in between as it relates to income, as it relates to whiteness. And so for spatial concentration, again, let's use a simple metric of every census tract rate needs to be above the Oregon City average. And so if 25% of households make over $125,000, and we look at Lake Oswego, every census tract is above that 25% average. Then we have spatially segregated. So that's taking the min and max of your census tracts within each city and figuring out which cities are in the top 15 cities that have the largest range between their min and max. So again, looking at City of Portland in the West Hills, there's a census tract where low-income households make up less than 3% of total households. And then you have a census tract out in East Portland, where low-income households make up over 40%, or sorry, make up over 50% of households. That range of roughly 50% is in the top 25. What happens is we basically situate each city based off of their profile for high income, low income, and whiteness. And we create this typology of sorts. Now, one of the things that we were looking into is like, well, within each typology, how do we identify, underperforming cities even within this group of racially concentrated and income concentrated cities? How do we differentiate the fact that Hillsborough, Forest Grove, Beaverton, Albany, do we treat all of these the same? What is the next step over here? And similar to the challenges that we ran in with the severe cost burning rate indicator, we ran into data reliability issues with the tract estimates. And so over here are bar charts of the high income estimates, low income, and whiteness at the census tract level. The main thing that I want to point out to here is green effect basically means that these are data that we can use or we have some sort of moderate to high degree of confidence that the estimate is real. And the ones in gray are the ones where there's a lot of range or a lot of error in the estimate. And for both high income and low income, only about a quarter or less than a quarter of these tracked estimates are reliable. And so what that means is that how that translates to specifically concentration, which, if you recall, is saying that every census tract has to be above the average. Here's a bar chart of high income, low income, and whiteness, and only about 50% of tracts are statistically different from the average. And so the way that changes our results is that we have these 30 cities that have some sort of concentration assignment, whether that's low income, high income, or race. There are 30 cities that we've identified as concentrated without incorporating margins of error. When we do incorporate margins of error, that goes down to 1 in 3. So it eliminates roughly 20 of the cities. And you'll notice that the ones that remain are primarily on for whiteness, which is not a surprise when you looked at that slide two slides ago. Excuse me, whiteness, the vast majority of these estimates are reliable. But what does that say about our ability to talk about income if we're looking at statistical significance? And really, this is why we've kind of come to the conclusion that you can't look at any of these indicators as a standalone, both on a conceptual level, but specifically on a technical level, because we're running into some of these drastic data quality challenges. And so overall, here are 3 takeaways that I would like everyone to of this presentation. If you learned nothing else, here are the 3 things. How do we identify underperforming areas within cities? Well, you can't, not really, at least not statistically, as what we looked at within the race and segregation metric. Well, how do we identify underperforming areas? Again, in combination with other equity indicators, your standalone indicator is not going to be meaningful. For example, if you see a vast reduction in severe cost burdening rate for a city, but that city also saw extreme amounts of gentrification and displacement, is that a win? Like, how do you balance out those two trends? And then finally, what are our next steps? And for us, it's to explore the different equity indicator combinations and typologies. And based off of whether you are a highly income segregated, race segregated city, also with low land efficiency, the policy recommendations that we would give that city are drastically different from one that is low income concentrated and white concentrated. And I believe that is the last slide. Thank you all for listening to my presentation. If there are any comments or questions, I will try to answer them to the best of my ability.
Yeah, I think we have a few minutes for questions. Ariel, you want to jump in?
Thanks. Really appreciate that presentation, Nick. I just had a quick question in terms of like qualitative pieces that might play in or other data. Like I noticed in one of the slides where you were looking at cost burden, for the cities, I think that we're at the top where I'll have significant university population, student housing population. So I think you're probably familiar with that, but I guess like, how does that play in? I don't, maybe you mentioned it, but I didn't hear it. So just like, if there's things like that, how does that factor into the analysis? And if it's a conversation with the city, or is that something that's built into the data framework?
Yeah, and I think so. I think for stuff like that's where I've assumed that that's really, those are the conversations that happen during the referral process. For the equity indicators, we are constrained by Oregon statute to produce quantitative metrics to guide these assumptions. I would say that the challenge, I think because of the data quality issues that emerge, the qualitative nature or the qualitative gathering of information is even more important to help ground truth a lot of the things that we're seeing in the data, particularly because there's such a disconnect between the lived reality and the digital reality.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that was the other piece, was like, obviously like student housing is probably going to be segregated closer to the campus. So just want to make sure that was on the radar.
Oh, you totally are, right. And in that example for Corvallis Eugene, we would be looking at their housing types produced and land efficiency. So based off of how they're performing in that way, we would compare it to how they're doing on the other equity indicators. We have a lot of hands up.
Actually, before folks jump in, can I just step in just to say really quickly, the whole point of today's discussion is to be focused on these kind of broader considerations in light of how we structure this in relationship to the referral process. So what I would ask is not jumping ahead of that and sticking your questions to more like clarifying questions about the equity indicators themselves. Just we're going to talk about this today. That's like why we're meeting. So just with that in mind.
That's helpful, Sean. Thank you. So you all channel what Sean just said. We'll bring it back into the conversation as well. So I think if we go Tom, Karen, Matt, and Al, and then Michael, and then Barbara. Thanks.
Yeah, this may be more of a latter question, but it seems to me like part of this is, what are we comparing it to? Are we comparing it between cities? Are we comparing it to the change over time? Right? That the performance is about changing over time, and are things getting better? And if you have this, how does that work if you have the same sort of data quality inadequacies in your base year as you do in your out year? Are you comparing apples to apples, and that's kind of okay?
Well, Nick, I don't know if you want to take a run at that. I mean, that is, Tom, one of the first questions we have is really how should the LCD be evaluating progress and performance? And that's, thinking about what that looks like over time and what the data foundation is. But Nick, did you want to just talk about the kind of the data piece of that question?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Tom. That was one of the early ones that we brought up, and that was one of the things that was giving me the most anxiety early on in this process, mainly because of the fact that for a lot of these cities that are under 65,000 population, they only have access to 5-year data. And so what that means is that realistically, the shortest amount of time, or the earliest that we'd be able to compare these estimates, would be 5 years from now, so like 2028. And at that point, the changes already occurred. Like, what are we trying to predict? And so there's a lot of challenges with just based off of the imprecision of the data for tracking it longitudinally. And that's even ignoring the margin of error issue, where even if you do compare a lot of these over time, they're not going to be statistically different from each other. And so that's why we've kind of, we aren't at a point where we're recommending or actively thinking about using change over time as a quantitative measurement of underperformance.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the conversation y'all will have, is kind of actions versus outcomes and what can you measure over time and from a performance standpoint. Let's go Karen, then Al, then Michael, then Barbara.
So this was a great amount of information, and I really appreciated the presentation. It's kind of stretching the way I think about things. And so not sure if where this comment is appropriate, but I'll just say in general, as we consider the urban unincorporated areas and how they're measured and what kind of data is available to them, I think it would be good to start seeing that integrated within these different presentations, because they themselves are unique, I'm sure, with regards to how we capture data for those areas.
Mm-hmm.
Good, thank you, Karen. And we'll be coming back to that also around just other kind of related questions. Al, and then Michael, then Barbara. Oh, I think you went back on mute.
One more time. Yeah. Okay. There we go. Really, really good presentation, Nick. Very, very helpful. Yeah, the data is extremely hard to work with. My question is maybe a little more basic, and that is, why are we starting with grading on the curve? Are we assuming that the average or median Oregon City is somehow doing okay? If this were Alabama or Texas, is it fair for us to assume that, because we're a state with a long history? So shouldn't we be taking as our baseline how each jurisdiction is doing now and looking at how it changes over time against how it's doing in the future?
So I may have, there's a couple of things that I might need to address. So to clarify, the average of what we're talking about is, and I need to specify, is that it's all of the Oregon cities above 10,000 in aggregate. It's not the average for Oregon City. We're not comparing it to the average of Oregon City. And then to answer your second question, or the more important one, which was like, why are we comparing it to other cities versus why we're comparing it to internally? I think part of this is part of a, how do I put this? there are cities and regions that are underperforming as a whole. And so if we just look at the cities like Oswego, Sherwood, Sandy, all kind of like together in aggregate form, they may not emerge as disparate trends when compared to each other, but they would emerge when you compare it to the other 60 cities. And so this is the equity indicators of why we're comparing it to on a broad case is in line with also the housing production dashboard, in line with also the affordability metrics, the other two factors that are will impact whether a city will be referred or not. And so it's in line with those methodologies.
So I think I guess the other question would follow up on that would be why isn't it necessary to do both? I mean, don't you really have to look at each city in context? But there's just no basis in Oregon for assuming any city is doing well at this time. You know, that's not how we grade Black people when they apply to college, or white people or anybody else. And it just seems to me that we are looking at the thing
Al,
through a really strange lens.
I'm going to hop in and say you're jumping ahead to the discussion. This is like why we're talking today.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Again, I'm asking just about, you know, why that metric. So I'll save that for discussion later. But key issue.
Yeah, thanks, Al. Michael, Barbara, and then we will get into the questions as Sean is diligently ensuring that we do. Michael.
I think I should probably defer to that in light of Sean's comment.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate a point that Nick made about the data. When I look at the census for my community, a lot of our data is outside our city limits. And so it skews our data. If you look at just the data in the city limits and you can't get there from the census. And so I really caution us in using the census data as the only factor, and would really like to see some other options for gathering new data to use in this exercise. Thanks.
Good, thank you, Barbara. So that will be again probably part of the conversation that we'll want to have together. So let's pivot. Thank you, Nick. Let's pivot into that space. And Sean and Thea, I'd love to bring you all in because we do have a set of questions that we want to work through. And but I'll help ask Sean and Thea to help frame the conversation, and then we'll dive into it.
Definitely. Yeah. No, thanks, Ben. And thanks, Nick, for setting that up. So we wanted to start with that to kind of give us a little bit of just like some background to help frame up our discussion in relationship to what we're tasked to do by the legislature. So I'll back up maybe to a little thinking about the purpose of this meeting as well as kind of the next two meetings. So this week we have our next rulemaking advisory committee meeting. They're focusing on kind of the needs and production side of the equation right now. They're focusing on, needed housing. They're focusing on those components of the discussion. And then at their next meeting on April 30th, we're going to have a more focused policy discussion around the housing acceleration program generally. And that means between now and then, we have kind of three major conversations that we need to have. The first one, which is what we're going to talk about today, which is the referral process. Next meeting where we're talking about this kind of audit process, this evaluation of like what local and state barriers might be affecting the production of housing. And then a third conversation about what are responses to that, how do we develop the agreement and what tools and incentives and funding sources, all those different pieces do we have in play that can help ensure that we take actions to address any barriers that we identify, right? And so with that in mind, right, this entire process is structured around kind of a central idea that, when it comes to the housing production picture, there's no way to quantitatively assess whether a particular jurisdiction is doing a good job or a bad job. It's not like in, say, for example, other jurisdictions, say, for example, California, where, say, if you miss a certain number or threshold, there are kind of these pretty significant consequences that apply. Rather, the approach here is to say, hey, let's, start tracking. Let's have these benchmarks that we're evaluating, we're tracking over time, recognizing they're perfect. And let's set up a process that's not punitive, but it evaluates our goals. It sees what our progress it is towards these different goals that we have. And where we're, kind of falling behind or where we're not making progress, we're stepping in with intervention. We're seeing what is going on. We're doing that qualitative deep dive to see what is actually happening, what are the factors that are affecting production, and then to kind of, come up with an action plan in response to that. That's the whole point of the Housing Acceleration Program. So this first part of the equation is the referral process, right? And there's kind of three, essentially what the direction is that DLCD periodically, annually, has to refer some jurisdictions into a housing acceleration program. There's 4 criteria that qualify for referral, 3 of which are pretty straightforward. If you miss your HPS deadline, you miss your HPS action deadline, or you're referred by an LCDC enforcement order. Those are pretty straightforward. But this 4th one is less straightforward. It's essentially directing us to kind of evaluate a city's progress or performance. And it gives us 3 kind of barometers to use. One about total production, that's relatively straightforward. One about affordable production, that's less straightforward, but it's generally kind of solvable. OHCS is doing a lot of thinking about that through the Oregon Affordable Housing Inventory. And of course, we have reporting that we're going to be revamping for that. And then this 3rd one that Nick presented on, as you can see, is very hairy, right? It doesn't by itself really give us an indicator as to, is there what's going on the ground? And really what it can provide us maybe is a little bit more context, but trying to rely on it is going to be pretty challenging. But these are the 3 barometers that we were provided. And essentially what our task is to essentially figure out, all right, DLCD, you have to kind of periodically evaluate, progress towards these 3 kind of benchmarks. And annually, you have to have some process by which you refer some jurisdictions in consideration of kind of regional dynamics that are happening, in consideration of how kind of peer cities are doing, right? If we hit a recession, we don't want to suddenly enroll everybody in the housing acceleration program, that type of thing. So with that in mind, essentially what we're trying to do in this conversation, we have a series of questions to start getting at these. We have these different data sources. They're all imperfect. They're all they all require context in order to use responsibly. And how can we start thinking about, in our RAC discussion, getting some considerations together, getting a range of potential options that could be considered by the RAC that we can start to chew on, start to have policy conversations on, and then come back with some additional direction, right? To see what the RAC discussion is around the referral process, to see what the priorities are. Because essentially what we're making a decision about here is essentially how kind of wide of a net we're casting, how we're going to use a limited resource, which is essentially kind of DLCD staff time and local government staff time in an audit process, right? And that means that you have to make trade-offs about how extensive of an audit you can do with how much time you have available to you. So that's kind of fundamentally the question that we're going to be getting at here. We have a series of discussion questions that I'll pass it back over to Thea and Ben to talk through that we're hoping to kind of start to frame out some considerations and some options for the RAC to start chewing on. Does anybody have any questions about that setup? Okay.
Thea, did you want to add?
No need to add. Yeah, I was just gonna move on to the, jumping into the questions. And Ben, if you want to just go ahead and ask those, I think that's fine. I know that this this group is already raring to go. So
I can tell. Yeah. Well, and please add, additional flavor to any of the questions. And I think we'll start with where you were just leaving off, Sean, right? If you think about that, how should DLCD be evaluating goals that are related to progress and performance for the referral based on those, what you call benchmarks, right? Total production, affordable production, equity indicators. So how should DLCD be thinking about evaluating goals for progress and performance?
And also in consideration of what considerations do you want to raise for RAC discussion on the policy considerations? I think we've heard some already around context around how we benchmark different kind of progress towards outcomes, that type of thing. But let's start raising those. Yeah, Barbara.
So one thing I haven't heard yet, Cornelius has a significant proportion of nonprofits already in the city providing various types of affordable housing. And as a result, our property taxes are significantly lower than other jurisdictions of a similar size. So how do you balance making sure that perhaps some communities are not overburdened with affordability compared to other jurisdictions that are underburdened?
Yeah, no, it's a good consideration. So, I guess the question is, are you asking me what I am doing for Cornelius to ensure that they're not overburdened? That's like why we're here today.
No, I understand that, but I'm wondering how do we measure it? How do we make sure that in our housing production strategy, we account for the affordability that we already have when we set that new target? And then how do we measure whether we're getting there or not? And
Well,
I guess
So I'm hearing you ask, Barbara, how do we account for existing affordability? Affordable units already in place, and to ensure that that's part of how we're measuring progress, starting with what's already existing.
yeah, I guess yeah, Barbara,
I just finish that thought real quick. And proportionality to the city size and the city's total income. Because you can't provide more affordable housing and become an insolvent city.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. And I like where you were ending. So I don't know if folks are trying to ask DLC to answer the questions. I think DLC is asking you to answer. And Barbara, what you landed on, right, is considering the impacts of existing affordable housing, the impacts on tax basis, the proportion to city size and city income, right? So I like this as a modeling to answer and respond to the question for how DLCD should be thinking about these things rather than trying to pose questions back. So I was glad we got to that. Let's go Michael and then Matt.
Would it be possible for you to paste the specific question that we're answering? I'm not sure I remember the exact phrasing.
Yes, I will. How should DLCD evaluate goals related to progress and performance?
Okay, the first one on the agendas. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Cool. There was a question, or there was Thea, you'd posted sort of a summarizing question on the Miro about how do we weight the three against each other, and I wanted to raise a thought about that. My understanding is that this is an or switch, and like if you are behind on any of these three, then that triggers an appropriate, like a action evaluation. That if you're a city that does really well on production, that doesn't get you off the hook on equity, or vice versa. Really well on one category of production doesn't get you off the hook on the other kind of production. That's my understanding of the legislative intent. Is that an answer to the question you posed, or is that a different question you were posing?
Well, I think that the question was essentially just to sort of spur the conversation. I believe you're right in terms of the legislative intent, Michael. I think that, production, affordability, and choice are all sort of like that's kind of the proxy language for that. And I think, the question is, how do we weight these factors if we weight these factors? So it's really open, and that was just, I think that was a question that came up in the team conversation, and I wanted to place it there to make sure that we can kind of get to that conversation. But I hear your concern that like those are all, those all need to be considered, and I think we can keep talking about it for sure.
And is that what you're suggesting? Like, Michael, you go to that next phase. Like, so there's the question around, is it total or affordable or equity or kind of a combination of all? Is there a suggestion?
My suggestion is that or is the appropriate way to do it. The remedies should be appropriate to the failure, right? But that they should be evaluated independently. One other thing, if I may, Nick, I thought you made a great case for the problems with census data. And Sam, Ariel, Sean, my sense of the reason that you've been put up to this whole thing is that we were in a room trying to come up with something, and Anna Molina and Alan Lazo insisted that equity needs to be part of this, and it was deliberately hand wavy. We didn't have time to go through all the work you've done to figure out what was possible. So at least my understanding of the legislative intent at the time on this was fully compatible with, there is going to be a bunch of bad data. We just have to do what we can. And where we have qualification, like where we have qualitative, to Ariel's point, differences, I think that's appropriate, at least per my understanding. But you should talk to Anna and to Commissioner Lazo. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Let's go. Matt, Ariel, Daisy.
Thanks. And Nick, that was a really good presentation. Will we have the opportunity to maybe look at the presentation offline, because it was a lot? So I would appreciate that. It was really interesting. You brought up a couple of issues that I had been thinking about a lot. And these are comments that are very general in nature toward how we frame these metrics. I guess one of the first issues I'd want to raise is this going to, are the metrics going to be forward looking? Are we going to be looking at housing production moving forward, or are we going to kind of set that baseline as what does a city look like historically? And this gets to a larger issue that I think is really important, and that is the metrics, to my mind, should be designed to drive good policy, and policy that addresses actual deficiencies, rather than metrics that are kind of designed to say, this city is segregated, you're bad, that's not the point of this. So I think the metrics, in my opinion, need to be kind of forward looking at, how are we designing our programs, our policies to address, what might be historical inequities and going forward. So that's one issue. Nick, you raised a good point in this idea about segregation, concentration within cities and without. So in the regional context that cities find themselves, because housing markets are regional. Our affordable housing providers are looking region-wide at opportunities for providing affordable housing. And so when it comes to looking at concentration segregation, I think the metric needs to be designed so that we don't end up with something that I think, as you're kind of getting at, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy where, Medford, the city of Phoenix, White City, and unincorporated Jackson County end up being the de facto affordable housing provider for communities like Ashland and Jacksonville. So I think that that's an important consideration in how we look at these metrics. And finally, a question that I have, I don't know, maybe for Sean, or maybe it's just something that could kind of be addressed later. And that is, all of us who have housing needs analyses, housing capacity analyses that we've done relatively recently address a lot of these issues. And I mean, some of them are flawed. Some of them are not maybe as good as they should be. Ours was done by Eco Northwest, so I know it's really good, and it addresses a lot of these issues and identifies the deficiencies that we're talking about here. So, what is the intersection between housing capacity analyses that we've already done, the ONA, and then these metrics? And doesn't that provide kind of that baseline for what we're looking at with a lot of these issues? I mean, certainly there are some things that could probably be improved upon in those housing capacity analyses, but there's a lot in there already. So
yeah, Matt, and I think that second qualifier to your statement kind of answers that question. So, as part of the housing acceleration program, essentially what it is a way of saying, oh, we should do a deeper evaluation of what might be happening, right? And there's, one scenario that already kind of speaks to that, right? If a city doesn't do their kind of regular goal 10 planning requirements, including the housing production strategy, that's just one thing that just, leads to a referral, right? So that's the process to say, is the city taking actions to, think about their needs, start adopting actions to address their need. But this is that second phase of saying, well, are those things working, right? Are we getting closer to outcomes that we want to see on the ground? And if we're not, what are we doing? Like, what might be going on? Like, what might be the actual barriers that are inhibiting that? They could be state barriers, they could be local barriers. We'll talk about that more in the audit process. But doing that deeper dive to see what might be happening underneath the surface, doing that more qualitative deep dive, recognizing that, the data is not going to tell us a full story, right? So really the intent of the referral process is to say, how can we structure that in a way that is, context sensitive enough, recognizing that it's intended to be kind of a barometer that leads to a deeper evaluation.
Yeah, Thea?
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in to talk about a little bit about what the process actually will look like, which is, and how the HPS fits in there. The HPS sort of lays out the strategies, and you're right, the city of Medford has an amazing one. I'm really excited to see, that work going forward. I think that what the statute lays out is that then at the midpoint, if a city is really struggling with their strategies there, this is an opportunity to jump in and go identify what the barriers are to really fully enacting the strategies that are laid out there. So it's all part of a piece. And I just I think that there's some confusion about how all these sort of new-ish elements fit together, and want to try to make that as clear as possible.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go Ariel, Daisy, Al.
Thanks. I think my questions are similar to Matt's. And maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but having been in the room for the legislative conversations and then seeing what we have pretty explicit in the statutory direction, is it simply a matter of kind of setting the various categories and metrics and then applying that to the city's either existing HPS or future, recognize some cities have done this already, and recognizing that what DLC is going to be looking for in future HPSs will probably be a refined version of that, since we have ONA. Is it matter of just kind of creating a matrix and recognizing this is going to be a little bit of a, choose your own adventure or contextual based conversation between the department and each city, and, using the data to the extent of its limitations and bringing in the qualitative pieces. I mean, maybe that's oversimplifying it, but I'm just wondering, I have to think DLCD kind of has this mapped out a little bit. You spend a lot more time in the text than we have. And maybe I'm getting ahead, but would it be possible? I personally respond better to things in writing, and seeing this mapped out, I feel like it would be easier for us to kind of dig into the actual words and focus on where the gray areas are that aren't already kind of outlined in statute, and where really getting into a more technical discussion about what needs to be further clarified by this group or confirmed. Is that?
Sure. Yeah, actually,
possible?
one thing we wanted to distribute before this meeting, we didn't quite have enough time to put the polish on it. So we're still just about finalizing it, but we'll send it out after this meeting. It'll be part for our next meeting. We have a policy brief that our consultant team helps prepare that kind of describes what's already laid out in the statute and where are those areas of kind of ambiguity that we need to answer as part of the rulemaking process. We are pulling from that brief for this conversation. Right. So this is one of those areas of ambiguity that isn't really clarified in the statute.
That will really be helpful to see, but also I'm thinking almost like a matrix, what is already required in an HPS? What are cities, right? What are, and every city is going to have a number. So we know that, but we also know we have it's more than just production. We want equitable planning, equitable production, different affordabilities, looking at race. So could we map it out matrix style and show what are the building blocks? What are cities going to be what's going to be evaluated in terms of the concrete actions the city is taking? And then how are we considering that based on production numbers, based on, historic segregation, and with room to account for a built environment and what a city's starting with, based on these things that people have mentioned? Is there a way to kind of have that kind of a tool that we could look at and react to and kind of say, hey, here's where Here's where we need more flexibility, but also consider what's going to be important and helpful to cities is some level of predictability, knowing that if they commit to these strategies, that's where a DLCD has signed off, and then you measure and kind of, it's always a tough needle to thread, flexibility and certainty and not being too prescriptive. But so that's the conversation I feel like we should be having. And without seeing stuff on paper, it's hard for me to feel like I can contribute productively to that.
Yeah, and I think part of that is that this is like the exploratory conversations before we start putting options on paper, right? And that's the intent of like what we
and maybe I could have more patience having been in the legislative conversations. I feel like we did that exploratory conversations in the legislature. And so it'd be helpful to just map out on paper, like where where those pieces are.
That's fair. Thanks, Ariel. And it will get into the approach question that we'll move into in a minute. Daisy and then Al, and then I'll move us into our next question.
I'll just say I really like Ariel's idea. I love the Matrix, so that would be great if we could see something like that. I'm trying to, give some helpful thoughts in your question. How should DLCD evaluate progress and performance for the referral process? My mind is in affordable housing. Affordable housing is, the more difficult housing type to build, of course, or deliver, more difficult than market rate housing. And I'm not a developer, but I think it's important to take into account funding availability, funding timelines. And from my understanding with conversations with affordable housing developers, it's currently taking about 5 years to develop or to deliver a project. From my understanding, Portland won't be seeking another affordable housing bond. Metro's affordable housing bond is almost fully allocated. We don't know if there will be a second one. This year, there are no PABs, is my understanding. So how is the? So I think this process should take into account the difficulty, really, of pulling funding together for affordable housing. Yeah.
Daisy.
How do you evaluate that, Daisy? Right, if that's the question, right? So if you just acknowledge, right, timelines, challenges, kind of barriers to production, like do you have a recommendation for how the LCD should be evaluating that kind of second piece of the, total, affordable, equitable?
I don't off the top of my head, but if others have thoughts as well, if we have any developers in the room, I'd be really interested in hearing.
Yeah, no,
I'll just add to, it might be useful to think through the sequencing of that, because like, for example, in the context, like let's say there is a referral on the basis of affordable housing that is stymied in a particular jurisdiction, we do a deep dive and we see like, oh yeah, there's these very disparate, patchy sources of funding networks, here's what's available. And that type of thing, like that can be the area for that kind of qualitative consideration in conversation with the cities and conversation with affordable housing developers. That's where we can do that kind of more contextual analysis. I think the question is are we trying to do that in the broad net that we're casting as to like whether we refer a city or not? That seems harder to do, right? Especially when I think, as we've noted, there isn't really like a consistent way of measuring this in a way that is, kind of has that rigor that I think was associated with the referral process. So just something to think about.
Well, and of course, to your point, Daisy, right, bonds are not forever.
Yeah.
And so you could make progress and then backslide if that's the way to think about it. So there's some complexities in that. Let's go Al and then Barbara, and then I'm going to move us to our next question.
Thanks, Ben. There seems to be something that's coming out of this, at least for me, tying it back to Sean's comment about sequencing. It strikes me that there is some kind, there are things out there that we can measure now. There are things out there that we might be able to measure in the future, but we've got to do some monitoring for. There are other things that we have to wait because sometimes things like building and funding and all those kinds of things take time. So what my question really is, can the referral criteria, referral recommendations recognize those realities and basically say, let's look at your approved housing production strategies, sort of community by community. And we'll find the things in there that we can measure the same way that DLCD and LCDC have been used to measuring transportation performance standards, which they've been working with for, a quarter century. Those are basically saying, have you rezoned here? Have you done this kind of thing? You've done these kinds of things. And then and kind of confine the referral trigger in the early days to the kinds of things that cities have committed themselves to that are measurable, which is mainly them taking actions to lay the groundwork for these other kinds of things that are less clear now. And I just don't know, Sean, whether you think that makes sense. And if you think it makes sense, is it something that the law wouldn't allow us to do?
Yeah, no. So what the law states, essentially, it states that we have to evaluate progress or performance. That's kind of a term that's subject to interpretation for these three different categories, one being total production, one being affordable production, one being at the equity indicators, right? It doesn't necessarily say that like how progress or performance is measured or provide any parameters around that. And so, as part of this, we could consider do we do this evaluation in light of what is within a city's adopted HPS? For example, if there's maybe some red flags on affordable housing and access to maybe opportunity in different neighborhoods that is signaled by the data, maybe not confirmed, and it's paired with maybe a lack of emphasis in the housing production strategy, maybe that warrants a deeper dive. I don't know what the right triggers ought to be or what that right contextual analysis is. And I think really the goal here is just to see, are there potential options or considerations we can bring to the rack?
Well, thanks, Sean. Thanks, Al. Barbara, I'm going to post the next question in the chat.
I just have one quick point to Daisy's comment and Sean about the affordable housing and production. Let's say a jurisdiction is low on their production. Is there a way as one of the tools to direct OHCS funding to those communities so that it's not punitive on the community, but that funding is then directed in that manner?
Yeah,
Just
we're
like
actually, we're actually going to talk about that next meeting, because as part of the audit process, we can request OHCS do a concurrent review, right? So if there's an instance where it's like, oh, maybe this warrants kind of that OHCS review to bring in that funding. And then, of course, we can consider other state agencies too as part of that overall picture. We can talk about that in the audit process at our next meeting. So that's a great question and something that we'll address in future discussions.
Okay, thanks. So I put the next question in the chat around the approaches that DLCD could utilize to establish a threshold. And y'all have teased probably some responses to this already, but love to open it up.
And just as a reminder, there's three, potential, total production, affordability, and specifically it's units of affordable housing that are affordable at or below 80% median family income, and then equity indicators. So with that in mind, let's start thinking about thresholds.
Yep, Michael?
I've got a general thought about the equity one. So without meaning to pick on Tigard, Tigard is relatively has relatively liberal zoning. A larger share of apartments are zoned there. The land is zoned for apartments, and almost half of that is within 300 meters of either I-5 or 217. That is something that there's nowhere else except in the equity indicator that Tigard would ever be prompted to change that. And that doesn't rely on census data to know that. That's all different objective standards. So I guess it seems to me that that's one of various examples of times we don't need census data to put a threshold to something if we wanted to. And then go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just curious. Are you suggesting that there's a proximity threshold? Like if you have a certain amount of affordable housing that's in proximity to a highway, is that like what?
I mean, you could base it on outcomes like that, but I think the idea is things within cities' control, as Barbara said last time, cities control zoning. If a large share of your 4-story apartment zoning is very close to freeways, then that's something you can put an objective standard to, it seems to me. Or maybe it counts for less if it's close to certain things. I don't know. I think that the EJ Council was referred to as like an authority on that, which makes sense, I suppose. And yeah, as the continued messenger of Miro, I wanted to lift up this question about, first of all, about moving averages. I wanted to echo Matt's comment about moving averages being a fair way to measure things when you're looking at the progress towards, and I also wanted to lift up the question of proportionate to your population size, what that phrase means. In the context of like acceleration, I don't understand what that would possibly mean, honestly. So I'd love any clarification.
Thanks, Michael. Sean, you want to attempt clarification?
No, it's a good question. I mean, because there's kind of, a couple ways you can interpret it. One, I mean, of course, the ONA allocations themselves are proportional to population, right? They're actually based in part on population and population growth. But then there's also the question of, is the legislative intent behind that to really think about this more in the context of capacity, right? So smaller cities generally have less staff, have a less ability to do things, right? And so when making this decision, do you try to find a way to factor that in? Of course, I think the question, and I think one of the pieces that your initial comment kind of gets at is this question of whether these thresholds, whether we should strive to make them more clear and objective or try to make them more discretionary and contextual, which I think is going to be, it's an interesting question. I don't know what folks here think.
Well, do folks want to reflect on? I mean, is that from an approach standpoint, should it be, what was your language, clear?
Clear and objective. It's pulling from a different life.
Yeah. Barbara?
So, as much as I'd like to say contextual, I think that Ariel's point of having a clear and objective matrix that could be, that every city can understand that this is the approach that we have to take. This is, if we don't meet this threshold, we need to do this and work towards this goal. The other thing I wanted to say is that not all cities have control over their future land supply. In the Portland Metro region, not everybody is treated the same because of the rural designations. And so to require a jurisdiction that has maybe 90% of the land as residential and developed is not the same. And this is how I'm trying to address Michael's point. It's not the same as a jurisdiction that still has hundreds of acres of land and very little residential development in proportion to their population size. So that's how I would see it as different, Michael. Just to put that point out there.
All right, thank you.
Also, for just a note too, we'll talk more about this idea of what's within, what's out beyond the control of the local government as part of the audit process. That's an explicit legislative kind of consideration that's supposed to be wrapped up in there, right? To think about, what are the factors, the levers that a city has control over, what are the levers that they don't, right? So we'll talk about that more in the future, but it's a good point. Thank you.
Thanks. Matt, then Ann?
On the proportionate to population, I mean, I think it's supposed to make it fair for all cities that are being reviewed. But I made a comment on the Miro board that I don't think it really gets at the metric that we're really looking for. And this is kind of my earlier comment about housing capacity analyses. We went through this process of within our specific communities, within that context of identifying deficiencies. And it seems like those deficiencies should kind of be the denominator that we're being compared to. So, I mean, it doesn't really matter what, how many units of housing that are affordable to households at 80 AMI or less compared to the, as a proportion of your total population. That's really kind of irrelevant if you're not meeting whatever you've identified as your need, or maybe what the ONA identifies as your need. But this is the way the law is written. So I don't know how much discretion we have to kind of address that. I understand the intent is to make things fair. I just don't think that that's getting at the issue that we're trying to address.
And Matt, maybe I should clarify something in the statute too. So that proportion of housing that's built that's affordable to people at 80% median family income or below, that is based, essentially a city's kind of benchmark for progress is based on their housing production target, which includes a target for all different income categories, right? So there's this allocation process. Cities respond to that in their Goal 10 process through their housing capacity analysis and housing production strategy. And then this is kind of a checkpoint to say, hey, if we're falling behind on outcomes, right, and we're not achieving the goals that we want to, then there's this kind of deeper dive that occurs, right? So that is the intent there. It is tied to something it is relevant because it's the targets that a city is directly responding to as part of their HCA and HPS.
Yeah, that makes more sense to me. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Anne?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what has been said by Matt, Ariel, and others. Daisy, I am thinking about how we would do this in Albany, and with the production dashboard, what are the indicators, clear and objective or not? Maybe it's a combination of meeting certain numbers or percents, but then also looking at how many strategies in the strategy matrix or dashboard, what Ariel was talking about, has the city actually adopted already, so that there's weighing not just numbers, but also the city's done all these things, but still we aren't necessarily getting affordable housing. And some of those reasons why could be numerous, whether it's lack of funding, lack of partnerships, wetlands, whatever it is. And then on the equity indicators, I was thinking about the work that we've had to do with the climate friendly areas, the PSU toolkit. They have an anti-displacement and vulnerability map. I mean, it's, it is what it is based on the data. But there's also an existing list of strategies that may or may not move the needle on gentrification or anti-displacement, that kind of thing. But, again, if we're doing these strategies in our zoning and what we have control over in our development code, ensuring that we have a variety of housing types and zoning allowed throughout the city and removing obstacles, then I feel like we shouldn't be dinged, for that as a city. So those are just my thoughts, to use some of those existing resources to help measure whether a city is succeeding and should be referred into, So.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Well, I'm going to move us to the next question that I put in around trade-offs and considerations. And this is both for you all to talk about, but also for the RAC to discuss in the referral process. And I do think, Anne, where you were going with kind of the balance between actions and strategies that cities are taking on versus outcomes that may or may not be within a city's control is one of those big policy kind of questions that the RAC certainly could chew on. But let's open it up. So when you think about what are those trade-offs, what are the considerations that RAC should be kind of bringing into its space based on this conversation or thoughts y'all are having? Yeah, Michael.
I've said this before. I'm sure I'll say this again. I think that one of the trade-offs is how much time it takes to do an audit, how much time, how many resources it takes to calculate the need for a referral, and the more clear and objective. Part of the reason that I think a clear and objective system has upsides is that it would take less time and less resources, and therefore could be processed in greater volumes and addressed more quickly by the cities.
Great, thanks. So just time and level of effort being one consideration. Thanks,
but that is a trade-off right there. Is how nuanced should this analysis be, and therefore how few cities will we be able to subject to this analysis?
Yeah, thank you.
Ben, if I could just jump
Yeah,
in. Michael, I think you hit the nail on the head, and like in terms of how we've been thinking about it a little bit, is the trade-off is sort of between a broad, a broad but sort of shallow analysis. So lots of cities with like a sort of shallow level of review, or a deep review of a very narrow set of cities. And that, or, of course, somewhere in between. So that's sort of, those are sort of two ends of the spectrum that we've been imagining as we've started to try to puzzle through some alternatives. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I think that's exactly the kind of conversation that we need to be having here. So very curious to hear what the rest of you all think about that.
Yeah, thanks, Thea. Let's go, Al and then Samuel.
Thanks, man. The question of fairness to cities is part of it, but the other part of it is that when you have clarity from the state in the way of guidance, is it really takes a lot of political pressure off both the staff off the LCDC, DLCD, and all the political players at the local level, and it makes it much less likely that you'll get pushback at the point of impact.
Yeah, thanks for naming that. Al, I see some heads nodding. Samuel, jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always humbled by the risk involved in landing on any particular metric. Like, to the equity point, typically the way that we have measured the level of segregation within a city is what's called the dissimilarity index. And if you even looking at Portland, it looks good compared to the national average, and it looks like it's been getting better. But the reason that it has been, getting better, that we're becoming less dissimilar, is because of mass gentrification. And so that is certainly we can always hope that we're going to get a particular metric right on the first go around, but we could end up creating some perverse incentives to really go backwards fast. So I don't have a tip to overcome that right now. Just something that we always have to be humble about and consider.
Yeah, so Samuel, you're describing that as a consideration for sure. Is there a trade-off in that comment, right? Like, so using one indicator might incentivize? Is that I don't know if I'm hearing the trade-off piece, but maybe help me.
I mean, I think that I think that the trade-off could be certainly that we prioritize, for instance, the quantity of affordable housing versus how it is equitably dispersed. That's always a potential trade-off. But even process-wise, looking at the dissimilarity index might give you a good snapshot, but if you are looking at progress on the dissimilarity index, it's going to give you a mirage of progress, essentially.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, no, thanks for unpacking that a bit. Barbara, then Annigan.
So Cornelius has historically been a majority Hispanic community, and many of the community members here are very proud of that fact and would like to retain that status as being the second most populous city in Oregon of Hispanic people. And it was originally founded, or not originally, but a lot of people who have lived here have been migrant farm workers and have spent a lot of time and effort in creating community around that and around the fact that it is a majority Hispanic community. And I hear what Sam is saying about the dissimilarity index, But I caution that using that index may swing our community in the other direction against the will of the people. So I just want to say that.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. And I know, Nick, we've had some of these conversations, just, the goal not being to disrupt thriving communities, right? Intact communities, or the goal, to your point, Samuel, not to be to let's get better because we're gentrifying, right? That's not right. How do we find those the right indicators to use so we're not promoting practices that will be harmful to your both of those examples? And jump in.
Yeah, I was thinking about Thea's comment about, the trade-off, Michael and Thea, with the broad but shallow analysis or a deep review of fewer cities. And I kind of think, well, when you look at 197A.130, I mean, are we wanting our cities to get referred? I think that we should set the indicators so that fewer cities get referred. But when you are referred, you really are those jurisdictions that need the support. You need help updating your HPS or adopting one or whatever. And I because what is the outcome actually going to be of going through the referral process, right? And if you're going to do that, you want it to be a meaningful outcome. I just think if we set up the indicators for success and try to support cities in their processes, that then if you get referred, it should be meaningful and more of a deep dive. I'm just thinking about that because of the time and the trade-off and what will the outcomes be. But I mean, I know we're trying to come up with indicators, but I think the statute outlines some good indicators already, and what we've already talked about for some ideas with the 3 areas: reporting, dashboard, and equity.
Yeah, thanks. And when you hear referral, are you thinking of it in like this is about supports, or are you thinking about it more as in the punitive enforcement path?
Well, I think, as cities going through this legislative process and hearing it all, we've thought of this as being punitive, and this is a lot of time and effort. Just help us get our housing production strategies adopted, and also get resources in our community so that we can actually start moving the needle on needed housing types. And so if we're going to go through this process, I feel like it should, cities that aren't doing anything, whether there's politics going on in their communities, whatever the reason is, I think that those are the ones where DLCD and others will need to spend time handholding and making sure they get through the process. But if cities are actually trying and for some reason maybe aren't meeting the production dashboard, whatever those indicators are, it seems kind of like a lot of effort to put them into referral if there's so many indicators outside of our control, kind of what I mentioned before.
Yeah.
I have a question about that, just to follow up. So, because I'm thinking about this, because the audit process is explicitly structured to direct DLCD to look for state resources and funding to help cities bridge gaps. So I don't know, in Albany, for example, I know there's a deficiency on an ODOT-owned facility, right, that inhibits production across the river in the city of Albany. That's like something that we can talk about in the context of the audit to structure it to be that resource bringing conversation. But do you think that that's not possible in the audit process? Like what, I guess the question here is should we close that off to a city when that would also, that closes off the conversation about getting resources out to cities too, if that makes sense. So
yeah, that's a really good follow-up. I hadn't thought about the audit and referral bringing resources to a city, because if that was the case, we would maybe want to, we want to be referred, but to get more resources. So, I think there's that balance there, but different cities will have unique challenges for trying to disperse housing types throughout the different area. But if we've got the zoning, we've removed obstacles for whatever it is to achieve the densities, and we've done what we can to create walkable, communities and all that. So maybe people don't have to drive across the river. should we be referred so we can get help to maybe build a huge bridge, which is millions of dollars? I mean, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I feel like there should be some resources available to help cities succeed and not be referred.
Yeah,
I mean, and you're punishing, you're rewarding the cities that for whatever reason haven't been doing their work. I don't know.
there's some language issues that maybe need to be resolved over. Thea, you jump in, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the way that we're thinking about this, and certainly the way that I read the statute, is not punitive or, you know, it's not about punishment or reward. It's about identifying barriers, cities that have barriers to housing development, and using the resources of the state to help those cities move past that. I personally am not seeing referral as you know, as a punishment or a, you know, a judgment call on a city, except that that city is facing significant challenges. So, you know, that's just the orientation that I think has been helpful for me as I start reading through this, and is the angle that we're taking, that I'm taking personally. And I, you know, just want to make sure that that message gets out there, and that's what we're talking about. Like, I want to, that's what I want to aim for in this conversation. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, Anne, and I think that that's sort of the elephant in the room, you know, or, you know, whatever, the elephant that we're all talking about. But I do want to address it, because I think that, you know, the point is to bring resources, to address the barriers, to partner, to you know, to achieve the production that we need to see. So anyway, I want to get back to hearing from you all. So
It's a good point, right? I mean, if folks are not just the interpretation, like when I hear referral, I think this, or I hear audit and I think this. But I think we're going to talk about this a little bit in question 4 around just referral related questions and issues that are important to address, and not getting to a place where you got to screw up in order to get the good resources, right, that you need. And I'm putting words in your mouth, Anne, but I think that is an important thing to work through. So I have Michael, Ariel, and Gust.
I just wanted to endorse Thea's and Ben's summary just then. And good, well, you raised good points. I wanted to respond briefly. Maybe there's a third way here between the broad, shallow, and the deep, thoughtful, and effective. It seems like you could potentially have a broad, shallow standard that is relatively that is more objective and is more geared towards solving the political challenges I've described it, right? And then you can also have a narrower, deeper set of actions that some of the cities that miss this the standard are also receiving as part of the thing. Anyway, I guess it seems to me that setting a standard is not itself punitive, but also that standard inevitably can be shallow without necessarily limiting what we do after somebody hits that standard test. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Ariel?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I think, and Michael, who's part of it, and Samantha, if she's still on the line, we had this discussion in the legislative conversation, just reflecting on Ian's comments, and what Sean was sharing is, I think we were under the anticipation that like all cities would not be producing and all cities are going to need resources. Yeah. And that there was a difference between a city not meeting production targets and then a city, as you've described, others have described, like who just aren't doing it, aren't doing what they said they would do in their housing production strategy. And so I think there's a way, and I think part of this will be like the messaging of the ONA and of the process. And I think it's really important messaging to the public, because a huge component of HPS is, of course, more equitable community engagement, and that's a lot of work. And making sure that what's being messaged to communities is like, you know, supporting cities to say like, we are considering these policy choices. Some of them are taxes, some of them are new fees, like whatever it is. And we're doing this because of the ONA direction and because of these equity goals and different things. So I think that's going to be a really important piece of understanding that the audit is not necessarily a bad thing, but that it's not also not punitive. And maybe there is a punitive path. And I think that's a whole other conversation. And maybe is several years down the road. Like I don't think we're quite there yet to say, like, other than like you're not doing what you said you would do. And I think there are different approaches from the state, but I think potentially mapping those out in kind of a matrix form would be helpful, or getting DLC's thoughts on that. The other thing I wanted to share, just in reflection to this current question, what other referral-related issues are important to address? And it was just kind of, I think, building off of Barbara's comments, like I would also hate to see like the work that the city of Portland is doing in planning with the Albina district. I mean, that's in some ways going to be a segregation of a community of color, but for good reason. So we don't want, and I want cities to be able to be responsive to what they hear from that critical required community engagement if their residents are telling them certain things. Now, if those things are not equitable, right? Or saying we only want, single family, we don't want low income, whatever, the challenges that cities are facing across the state. We've got to equip cities with tools to say, no, the owner requires us to do these kinds of things. We just don't want the outcome to be, hampering Cornelius's work, Portland's work, and those things. So I just wanted to build on another example, not to speak for Portland with Tom sitting there, but I think there's a way to do it. And I guess that's why, just going back, like having kind of some words on paper and talking about what the different audit paths look like and what the referral triggers are and what it actually means. Like, are you getting resources, or are you, and what's the degree of resources and what's the degree of, I guess, DLCD intervention, depending on a city's actions. And then the last thing is, I think that we have a number of cities who know what their barriers are, either because they've just done an HPS or HCA, or they just know. They know about the bridge. They know about this barrier, that barrier. They know that land's not developing. And so making sure there's a pathway that cities don't have to go through a specific process just to identify the barriers that they already know are there. I'm assuming that's going to be built into the HPS and that's part of their process, but just accounting for that as we talk about it and realizing some things are going to be identified earlier versus later.
Sure.
Thanks, Ariel. Gus, you had a hand up earlier.
Thank you, Ben. And I was just going to build on what Ariel said and say that the language concept that you mentioned a few minutes ago about how we prepare cities to create an environment where they can be successful doesn't have to be a negative statement, right? So using a certain type of language, I think, would be important. But two things. The process that I think would work for all cities, rural cities like Baker City and cities like Portland, is to make the first step be super easy access to something that is quantifiable. So let's say you have to, if you're not performing as a city, if you're not performing, here's the first step that we want you to take, and that's to do X. I mean, I'm not saying I have the answer, but just you have to do this. And because I think what can happen is time can pass, right? And then all of a sudden we're trying to help them play catch up in an environment where that's not really an acceptable process. And so to me, that making that super easy access to help, and let me speak from Baker City. I mean, I'm over in LeGrand, but let me speak to Baker City. They would need access to assistance in helping them find ways to do certain developments, because they can't just access tools and resources that more urbanized cities have, right? So they're going to need, they're definitely, or communities like them are definitely going to need access to something that's really accessible. So, and then second part of that is, as we start to create ways to assist the RAC, I think it's important for us to realize that we all come from an area like this, this concept of, I can't remember even the term because it's the first time I heard it, displacement, whatever the rest of that was, first time I heard the term. But I can tell you what it takes to, say, get concrete contractors into your community. So, our lenses are so different as we come together to try to assist, that I think it's important for us to not be to kind of step outside of our area of expertise. I have a tendency to do this myself, where I'll come home at night and talk to my wife about one of our projects, and she's like, Gus, I don't, you live in that environment. I'm not tracking with you. So, you know, and I can't even remotely get granular with her because it's just too big of a nut to crack, right? So I hear that a little bit in what we're saying. So as we communicate with each other and the RAC, I think it's important for us to remember we all kind of have a certain area of expertise that we're trying to bring together to help. So thank you.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Gus. Let's go Samantha and then Tom.
Yeah, I'm just gonna tack on to what Ariel was saying. I think, and just to again help provide some context for what was discussed when the statutory framework was being, put into place. And I think on this point, what it's important to understand is that there's different levels. And I think what the term that we were using was proportionate and escalating. There was a very conscious effort that through this process, if a city preferred and the audit takes place, that's not necessarily enforcement or any sort of accountability measure would have to be proportionate with what was going on. If there's a city that has if this is just a budget issue, or if this is just, a funding issue or a technical resource issue, they're not going to get the hammer. And that framework is pretty outlined in statute, and that was an understanding that we have. I do want to flag, though, there is a punitive element to this, but that comes much later, and it comes with if there's, willful disregard for state housing laws, if there is kind of an open practice of, violation or disregards of fair housing laws or whatever. I mean, the pretty serious things are going to be faced with a punitive, lane. But again, that is pretty far down the road, and and the agreement that has to be in statute has to be proportionate, and above all, the local government's not going to be held accountable for something that they don't have control over. So I think there is an element of like a little bit of fear around this, but to Ariel's point, I think, as the rules get drafted and the program gets rolled out, if, the department and, all of us as RAC members are able to work together on messaging and, understanding through compliance, then I think a lot of that fear hopefully will dissipate. But I just wanted to reiterate, there was just a really conscious effort to make sure that no city was just going to get the rug ripped out from underneath them for something that's not within their control, or face, an arbitrary or capricious type of enforcement measure when that's not.
All right. Thank you, Samantha. Tom, and I think you might be the last comment for today.
Yeah, this is back to the segregation question, and maybe a question for Nick. We've been looking at some of the stuff that California's been doing around racially concentrated areas of affluence. Sort of what are the areas that are persistently white and affluent and haven't changed? And sort of that's where the focus of the housing strategy should be. You still want to monitor what's going on in sort of the BIPOC segregated areas, and there's a certain amount of community sort of determination, anti-displacement, anti-gentrification work that wants to go in there. But I'm wondering if that as a secondary measure, that racially concentrated areas of affluence might be an additive analysis to be part of the conversation.
That's a great question, Tom. Yeah, so in terms of using this example in terms of white concentrated, high income concentrated, that is an outcome, or that is like a typology in the current housing segregation by race and income metric. So I guess to kind of address your question, yes, the policy recommendations for those groups of cities is going to be drastically different from the other ones where it's like low income segregated, where we might be more focused for if it's a low income segregated city, we might be more focused on how those patterns that we're seeing is in relation to the gentrification and displacement risk model. Whereas for the high income, high white cities, we might be actually more interested in the land efficiency and housing types produced metric and how those two things are measured. So I don't have, it's a, again, getting back to that question of clear and objective versus discretionary contextual. In this case, I would very much strongly encourage discretionary and contextual, because the cities are different, markets are different in this case.
Well, or even within a city, the larger you get, the more differences, the different sides of the tracks or wherever. And so even within a city, looking at those sub areas, obviously the West Hills are vastly different than East Portland. And we have sort of two different approaches there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Nick. So I think I'll see if we have any other last comments on that final question, but otherwise we can begin to kind of close out. So are there other issues around the referral process? Y'all have named a lot of stuff, so I don't want to keep pushing you to come up with more things that are on top of your mind that you've been thinking about for months and years and semi-lifetimes. And I talked long enough to inspire you to jump in.
Yeah, so I really like the idea of an audit. That term to me is, hey, you've done all these things. We're still having issues addressing housing needs that are in your HPS and on the dashboard. And you could use some resources because, so I like that, what everyone's been saying, the support of, hey, let's do an audit to see how we can help you, whether it's OHCS funding or whatever it is. That word to me, I kind of think of it as like sort of the periodic review word, or, sort of how can we help in assistance with the audit, and then trying to reach more cities that way rather than doing the fewer deep dive. And of course, then there'll be the ones that were mentioned by Samantha where there is the punitiveness. So thinking positively about it, and the wording and the language and messaging is really important, as everyone else has said. But I think that many cities need support. So how do we make this something positive and get that support to the cities?
Yeah, thank you for that. Al?
Let's see here. Yeah, really a question for Nick and a comment as well. One of the things that Oregon is especially weak on is we have a big discrepancy in home ownership between Black and white communities. That is a tenure issue, and tenure is specifically called out in the statutes and the goal. And apparently it's something that's measurable because we've measured badly on it. So is that a criterion that we can use going forward in this referral process? Changes in that discrepancy.
I really like that question, Al. Yes, the data are available by race and or ethnicity by home ownership. Where it gets tricky, and what we're seeing particularly in the data of how we would track progress is specifically the differences in the noise pre and post 2020. And so when you look at the home ownership rates by race and ethnicity, even comparing 2019 to 2021, there are large erratic jumps between those periods, because they're fundamentally calculating that using different types of survey weights. But the larger thing is the difference in how people are reported racially and ethnically between 2010 and 2020. And so anytime you're doing a longitudinal comparison by race, it gets tricky because you don't know how much of the data or the change you're seeing is real and how much of that is due to a change in self-reporting. And unfortunately for the 2020 census, which has been the worst one quite frankly, in 30 years, a lot of the changes that we're seeing, we just don't have a whole lot of certainty in saying that's how much of it is real, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Al. Thanks, Nick. Barbara?
One last point on that with regard to the last point. So Cornelius has one of the highest home ownership rates, and in delving into it with some of our city councilors who are who identify as Hispanic, they have told me anecdotally that when a Hispanic family they tend to pool their resources and buy a home, and then they pull their resources from that home to buy another home, to buy another home, to buy another home, so that everybody in their multi-generational family owns a home. And then two more things. We just had 2 applicants come in with very young families, under 3 kids under 3, both families, putting their applications in for an ADU because they want to build generational wealth for their kids. So I just want to say that and you won't see that in the data because we know from our residents that they don't report, they don't fill out the census because many of them are frightened about being reported and deported. So I just want to put that out there.
No, thanks for naming just one more layer of complexity in the data landscape and undercounting and underrepresentation of what's actually happening on the ground. And, you know, Barbara, I think your point just lends itself to some of the other pieces that came up around the overlay of qualitative and local contextual ground truth information, right? And you know, it's a hard thing to reconcile with, you know, I think where you started us today, Nick. Any last comments on the questions for today? I'd love to sit in this conversation for a long time with y'all. This has been fun. Thanks for having me. Thea, Sean, yeah.
Yeah, we do have to pivot about talking about the homework. Before we wrap up.
I sent Ben a little note to let him know that we could go over, we could keep that good conversation going because there's not that much in the homework that we haven't kind of discussed already. And I really appreciate those of you who were able to get in there. I think that, you know, like I said, we've kind of been able to shine a light on some of the comments. I saw a big theme of highlighting a need for clarity and predictability, which we also heard today in the conversation. And I think is also something that the RAC will hear loud and clear when we talk to them on Thursday. So I also saw a couple of entries there on the Miro board about who, how, what to audit. And this is exactly where the conversation is going next week. So what would be great is if you guys can jump into that Miro board again, just to sort of get your gears turning about the audit process, drop some thoughts in there, read about what everybody else is thinking about, so we can jump into that conversation ready to go on next Tuesday. I'll send out the link again following this meeting. I think that's all I needed to talk about. If you have any questions, of course, please reach out to me. I am not sure if there's anything else that we need to talk about before we jump off.
Other than y'all are meeting without me, April 9th.
You're always welcome, Ben.
Yeah, you know, I might peek in once in a while. No, y'all meeting April 9th and you've teed up, I think, the conversation that you'll be having around the audit really well today. So with that, just I'll express my appreciation for this conversation, and always love being in space and community with people that are so actively engaged in such an important issue for our state and all of our communities. So with that, appreciate you. Give you 7 minutes back in your life, not in this room. And thanks, Nick, for joining, Sean, Thea, and the rest of you. So have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.